Well, we're starting a brand new sermon series today on the book of Esther, something I've long been planning on doing. And in like 20 years of preaching ministry, I find this hard to believe, but I've never taught this book, nor have I never preached this book. So this will be a challenge for me, learning alongside with you. And it's an unusual book for a lot of reasons. I was thinking about this book, and I just go on record here, and I'm going to say I am a Star Wars geek. I'm a Star Wars fan, all right? And the newest series on Disney Plus is the Ahsoka series. So if you have kids at home, or maybe this is something that you like, there's a villain that's reintroduced in the Ahsoka series, finally in live action. We're all very excited about that as Star Wars nerds. And his name is Grand Admiral Thrawn. There he is up there. He's a menacing presence, as you would imagine, with those bright red eyes and that kind of pale blue skin. What's interesting about Thrawn is every villain in the Star Wars universe is like Force sensitive. You know, you got like the great Emperor or Darth Vader, you know, like they're able to use the Force and the dark side. Thrawn is not. Thrawn, in fact, what makes him so menacing and so intimidating is in the story, he is a tactical genius. And with those red, menacing eyes, he's able to see all things evidently before him before they even take place. So we might say it this way: Thrawn plays chess while everybody else is seemingly playing checkers. And he's always seemingly 3 or 4 steps ahead of his enemies, and he's looking to fulfill his own selfish gains. And that's what makes him a great villain in the story. Now, I use that as an example not to exhort you to go watch the Ahsoka series, though I think you should. But we could share that together. But I use that as an illustration because a lot of people, unfortunately, think of God this way. Maybe they think that God is a menacing figure, if you will, who looks to the corridors of time and strategically plays and positions different people and events against each other, ultimately to fulfill his own agenda. So I just ask the question to you to consider as we go to the book of Esther: is God a tactical genius? Suppose it's how you ask that question, but I would have to say definitively, no. And here's what I mean by that. God is not a tactical genius in the sense that he's a great cosmic gambler, organizing this event and that event to come to a purpose that he wants to fulfill. The God of the Bible has already decreed all events to which they would occur, and then he oversees, through his divine providence, the events in which they are carried out. Now, I have immediately plunged you into mystery. Admittedly so. And that's one of the things I love about the Bible is the God of the Bible does not fit into our little preconceived understanding and boxes that we construct for him to fit in. But the bottom line is that God sees all things. And he's not just a genius in that he's playing the odds. He actually decrees all things for which they are to happen. And my goal over the next few weeks is to try to prove that to you through the book of Esther. Now, when we look at this idea of God and his providential will, it is evident all over the pages of Scripture. One of the most prominent places that this occurs is actually in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. You might be familiar with it. It's Joseph, and he is interacting with his brothers, who his brothers at this time, their father had passed away, and they're wondering, I guess Joseph is finally going to exact his revenge on us. I mean, we did that slavery thing and like sold him off into like Egypt, and that's bad, and he's a lot more powerful, so here we go. And so what Joseph does, he looks at his brothers, he says, what you intended for evil, God intended or decreed for good. It's a great mystery. In fact, it's evident all over the story of Genesis, all over the story of the Bible, that God is using sinful human beings and sinful agency to ultimately accomplish his divine will. See this all the way back even to the Garden of Eden. Again, this is mysterious as we ponder this anew. And so the book of Esther is fascinating for a number of reasons. Number one, most obvious, God is seemingly absent from the book. There's no mention of the divine name, the Lord, the Yahweh. There's no mention of God. There's no mention of his sovereignty. There's no mention even of the law. The Jewish people that are in the book seemingly aren't very Jewish, to be frank with you. It is a very unusual book, and it would seem on first reading that God isn't present in the book at all. He's not even a character in the book. But my appeal to you as we begin this series this morning is that God is not absent in the book. In fact, God is in fact the main character in the book. He is the one that is moving all things in accordance to his perfect will. And this God, the God of the Bible, the God who is standing hidden in the shadows, perhaps, of the book of Esther, is not a tyrant or a tactical genius like our friend Grand Admiral Thrawn, but he is a God who is infinitely good and worthy of your highest affections. For that which God has decreed is ultimately sourced in his divine intellect and divine will, and that is ultimately good because God himself is good. He is a God worthy of your highest adorations and affections and worship. And so we're going to be looking, just in some ways, in summary, I'll read some of it, the first two chapters of the book of Esther, try to lay kind of the set the table before you. We're not going to read everything. You might want to go do that later on today or this week and to really ponder some of the things that I'll say, at least by means of introduction. But let me just kind of start here and just kind of ask some questions for us as we think about the book of Esther. It might not be super familiar to all of you, except, maybe the VeggieTaleization of the story. It's actually quite a PG-13, potentially rated R book, which I'll try to be very tactful and tasteful in the way we tell it today and throughout this series. Number one, the first question that we ask is, what is the historical setting? Well, the book takes place actually in the Persian Empire. And the Persians reigned, and they had their main empire in the theater of global expansion took place from, if you're keeping score, 539 BC to 331 BC. And there's a main character in the book, the king. We often call him Xerxes. That's probably how you most know him. But his name is Ahasuerus, I think is how you would pronounce his name, the Hebrew name. Now, he reigned, Xerxes, we'll just call him that just to keep things straight. He reigned from 485 to 465 BC. And the events of the book of Esther aren't told anywhere else in the scriptures, but if you put everything on a timeline, you would put the book of Esther between Ezra, the book of Ezra, chapter 6 and chapter 7. What's interesting, this was really not super obvious to me upon first reading, but the events of the book actually take place over the course of an entire decade. We often read the book of Esther, we think it takes place maybe the course of a week or two, but that's not actually the story. It takes place over a considerable length of time. Who are the main characters in the book? Well, again, we've already said that the Lord, God, is the one who is the main character, but we have several other characters in the book. We have, first of all, the Jewish exiles who are in the Persian Empire. And I want to stop there, and I just kind of want us to think about this for just a second. Cyrus was the Persian king who deposed the Babylonian Empire, and it was under Cyrus that he allowed the exiles to return back to Jerusalem. This was some 50, 60 years before the events of the book of Esther. So ask yourself, what in the world are the Jewish people doing still in the Persian Empire, in Susa and the different capital locations? And you would be asking a legitimate question. We don't know why they're there. They probably are there, frankly, because they didn't know any different. They'd been there for some time, and they became accustomed and even kind of really assimilated into Persian culture. They're perhaps Jewish by nature, Jewish by some theological convictions, but they've lost a lot of their Jewish identity, it would seem. They're not really Jewish in their behavior. Who are the recipients? Why was this book written? To whom was it directed? Well, it's probably not directed and written just simply for historical record for the Persian exiles. It's probably written for the exiles who would return. And so most scholars think that this book was written perhaps by Ezra, perhaps even by Nehemiah, perhaps by another scribe who is unnamed, but they wrote it, and it was directed to really encourage the Jewish exiles who had already returned. And as you know, your Old Testament history perhaps, you know as they settled and resettled into Jerusalem and in the Promised Land, things didn't really go well for them. In fact, it took them really the better part of 20 years to rebuild their temple. Nehemiah laments that their fortifications, their walls around Jerusalem are just in constant rubble, and they were vulnerable to invaders and attacks. And not only that, the spiritual climate when they returned from exile wasn't really all that great. And so most scholars think that this book was written in a way to encourage those who had already returned and said, here's what you need to know. You people might be an utter failure, but God is good. God is the one who stands behind his providential will. And here's an example and a story in which you need to know. What's interesting about this book, again, just by means of introduction, is we have the festival Purim, the origins of the festival Purim, which is detailed in this book. Purim's a little interesting because it's not a Jewish festival that was detailed in the law. It was a Jewish festival that remembered exactly how God providentially took care of his people. One thing that's kind of interesting, again, I hate to throw all this information at you, but just follow me for a little bit longer as we think about the historical details. One thing that sometimes people raise is there's no real historical record for Queen Esther. Now, we do have historical record, perhaps, of Vashti. She goes by a different name, Amistris, and she was the mother of Artaxerxes, who would be the king after Xerxes. And it's very likely that she is actually deposed and banished from, as we'll look at in chapter 1. But Queen Esther is not really mentioned anywhere in the historical records. Let me just say that's not unusual. We're talking about Persian, ancient Near Eastern record keeping. And what was most important to the Persians, as well as any other ancient Near Eastern empire, were who were the kings and what did they accomplish in battle. That was really the most important. Xerxes, we do know from history that he was a man with a sharp temper, short fuse, and he was and had a reputation of throwing raucous parties, which we'll see in chapter 1. What are some of the literary themes of this book? Well, actually, I asked ChatGPT these questions. It actually used AI to come up with this. So I don't take credit for these, but I agree with every single one of these because I think it's dead on the money. The first one that we see, the first theme that we see in this book is divine providence. Again, I've already said it, but the mysterious hand of God moving throughout the affairs of human history and the empires of humanity. God moving throughout, but also in small ways where he moves through the events of Mordecai and Haman that we'll meet later as a villain. We'll meet Esther, of course, and all these different people. Another thing that you see is a theme that I think we can all relate to, especially those of us that are young, is that there's this theme of courage and bravery, which is on display in this book. It was Esther who demonstrated unique courage and bravery as well as Mordecai. One thing that we see, and concurrent with the theme or the title of our series, Hidden, is that there's so many hidden identities and hidden agendas throughout this book. And it really takes until the very end for all of these things that are in the darkness to be exposed in the light and come to fruition. One thing that we all relate to is that there is a theme of justice and revenge in this book. There's a thirst in all of us to exact justice and to take revenge when we feel wronged. And you see that here. There's the theme of festival and celebration of God's providential care. There's the theme of power and authority that we can all relate to and understand. But also there's a theme of irony and the reversal of events in this book. The book of Esther, at least on a literary level, is beautiful literature. It is worth pondering anew and to see how the author, the biblical author, through the divine inspiration of the Holy Spirit, brings all kind of ironic events into focus. So let's look together finally at chapter 1. Again, we're just going to summarize here, beginning for the first 9 verses. And what we have is really in the first chapter is we have this story of out with the old. Vashti is the queen, and we meet Ahasuerus here, otherwise known as Xerxes. And we're told in chapter 1 that he throws a party, and the party is to last 180 days. And most scholars think that this is probably in preparation to gain favor of generals, as well as to prepare and to organize all the logistics for Xerxes to go on his famous campaign to exact revenge in Greece. You might be familiar with the Battle of Thermopylae. This is all related to this time period. And so he throws this huge party. And this party lasts, again, 180 days. And then we also have another party that is thrown kind of on the heels of this, a 7-day party. And this party was for everybody. Everybody. And the queen even had her own party at this time. And it was an opportunity for Xerxes to not only just throw a party, but to show his lavish wealth, the author tells us here. All kinds of costly stones and decor. But look with me in chapter 1, verses 10 to 12. And we find the behavior of the king here on full display. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, I'm going to go for that, Zethar and Carcass, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. By the way, those names will be on the test at the conclusion of this series. To bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti does the unthinkable here. She refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. I want to stop here again just to focus a little bit on this idea of providence. And we'll get back to this at the end of our message throughout this whole sermon series. You'll see this time and time again. But it just so happens that the king and his council elect to bring Vashti, and it just so happens that she refuses. And I say that in some ways facetiously in quotations, because there's no coincidence in this book. They're all these events are proceeding in the way that God has orchestrated them, mysteriously so. But that doesn't get the king's behavior off the hook. He's despicable. He's a terrible, terrible person. And they want to bring Vashti out, and they want to just gawk at her. Now, we're not told exactly what that is going to entail, but you could perhaps use your imagination. Some scholars actually speculate that Vashti was pregnant at this time with Artaxerxes. That might explain why she didn't want to come out and be gawked at. But whatever she did, or whatever her motives were, we understand, at least from the text, that it was a high offense to reject and deny the king. The king was the most powerful person in the empire, and she put her foot down and said no. And the king is absolutely beside himself, and he's furious. And so we know what happens perhaps in the story, if you're familiar with it. She is banished from the king's presence from this point forward. So she is no longer a character in this story. And all the council members, all the people come together with the king, and they concoct this idea, and they say, listen, what she did was so flagrant, we need to make sure that there is a rule on the books that no kind of behavior like this will ever be tolerated in the Persian Empire. Because what the women might do is they might hear of Vashti's rebellion, and they might act in accordance to their own husbands. We might have domestic violence and domestic all kinds of problems. So, king, here's what we're going to do. We're going to submit a royal decree that this kind of behavior is completely out of bounds. Oh, and by the way, Vashti, we don't ever want to see you again. This is the kind of culture that we're dealing with. These people are horrible. They're not good people. He's not an honorable king by any stretch. And so when you get to chapter 2, we have out with the old, and now we have in with the new. So chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, again, I'll just summarize it for you here. After these things, when the anger of the king had abated, he decides, hey, it's about that time for us to bring in a new queen. And historically, after these things, probably includes his campaign to Greece, and now he's returned, and perhaps he's somewhat lonely. He hasn't had a queen for some time, and so he says, well, maybe it's a good time to enlist and to bring a new queen into the fold. And so they go on this great quest to find all of the young, eligible bachelorettes in the kingdom, bring them to Susa so that they might enjoy habitation there in preparation to meet the king one by one. Now let's read 2:5 through 9, and you begin to see God's sovereign hand at play here in the events of this story. Now, I love that. Now, just by coincidence, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle. For she had neither father nor mother, and the young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. And so when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. There's a lot going on here in this section of the story, but it's a little bit like an ancient Near Eastern episode of The Bachelor. It's kind of what it is. Again, you have the king, who is the most eligible bachelor in the empire, wants to find a queen, and they bring in all of these beautiful young women, and it just so happened that her name is Hadassah or Esther. She is the most beautiful of all, and she earns the favor of those who are taken to give custody over all of these beautiful young women. And so what we see immediately with her, again, we'll see this time and time again, is that she is physically beautiful, but she's also internally quite beautiful as well. She has a sweet spirit, it would seem, to her, something that made her very, very attractive. I heard this story one time about a preacher, and one of the women came to him and said, Pastor, I just have something that I really need you to pray with me about, and I'm really, really struggling. And my struggle is this, that I just am convinced that I am the most beautiful woman in this church. And it's really causing me to be quite prideful, and I feel like I'm stumbling about that. And the preacher thought for a moment and says, well, I don't have anything to really counsel you on your pride or anything like that, because what you need to know is that you're wrong. You're mistaken. Don't worry about it. It's not a sin. And then in this case, it's just a horrible mistake. Esther, however, is the most beautiful woman in the court. And that will come to fruition. Now, we're also introduced to a man named Mordecai. What's interesting is his name is probably a derivative of Marduk, who was the 5th century Aramaic god of this region. And so we are told that he is a Jew. But again, one of the things we've seen about these characters already is how deeply flawed they are. And though Mordecai was a person of trust and he believed in God's providential care, he really wasn't that virtuous of a guy, it would seem. Now, there's a little detail here. I just want to introduce this and just kind of, so we don't gloss over it. The text tells us that he actually came during the exile. That's probably kind of a shorthand way of saying that his ancestors were the ones that came with Jeconiah and the Babylonian deportation, because this would put him like over 100 years old if this was a chronological detail. So, in other words, Mordecai had grown up there. He had been there for a long time, and he was a shrewd politician, as we'll see. And one of the things he encourages Esther to do is he says, I need you to disclose or keep your true identity hidden. So let's take a look here at verses 16, or rather verses 10 through 11. Verses 10 through 11. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So he takes great care. He evidently loves Esther. But then we have to ask the question, the uncomfortable question here, did Esther even have a choice in this matter? And I don't think so. I think in a lot of ways that she could be considered a victim of this entire tragedy. And Mordecai perhaps even set her up, but he actually does show some care for her. Now, as we go on throughout the story, we won't read it here for obvious reasons, but every woman, one by one, is brought into the chamber of the king. And it comes time for Esther to actually have her time with the king. And she's outfitted with all kinds of cosmetics that we see and all kinds of things. And the king takes great favor in her. Coincidentally, I might add. You get where I'm getting at here. And so we read in verses 16 to 17, the king's choice, in verses 16 and 17. When Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Again, the events of chapter 1 and the events of chapter 2 here span the course of about 4 years. Considerable time had taken place. Now, I want to pause here just in our last remaining moments together, and we've read all this and we've set the table for this sermon series. But I want us to come above the text for just a few moments and think theologically about what's happening here. The very first thing that I think that you're seeing throughout this story, and you will see throughout this story, is God's providential hand mysteriously working through the affairs of human beings. And so you might be wondering, I haven't defined what providence is. And one theologian, Wayne Grudem, has this to say about providence. I think this is a succinct and very well-stated definition. Providence is this: God is continually involved with all created things in such a way that he, 1, keeps them existing and maintaining the properties with which he created them. 2, cooperates with created things in every action, directing their distinctive properties to cause them to act as they do. And 3, directs them to fulfill his purposes. Now that's a mouthful, and you might be wondering, well, I'd love to learn more about this, and this is a shameless plug for our Wednesday discussion called Knowing God, because we are going to be spending a considerate amount of time on this subject of providence throughout this series, but also in our study of who God is. Now, number one, what I want to just come back here, and I want to kind of just give you a biblical picture of the biblical doctrine of providence, so it hopefully provides us some comfort. Number one, God preserves his creation. Providentially so. In fact, Colossians 1:17 states that Jesus upholds all things and holds all things together through the word of his power. So all things continue to exist, frankly, because God wants them to exist. And should God and his providential reasoning decide for them not to exist anymore, he could simply snap a finger, not even do that, and things would cease to exist. So part of providence is that God keeps the planets in orbit, and he keeps all things and all atoms and all electrons and all molecules glued together in accordance to his perfect providential preservation in his will. Number two, God works mysteriously through all beings. And you might say, Pastor John, I want you to explain that. I can't, and neither can you, and you will join a long history in church history pondering this question. Does God decree sin? Does God actually on the hook for sin? And the answer is God does not sin, but God somehow uses sinful human beings. In fact, that's all he has at his disposal. And if God is going to bring about the affairs of human history to an appointed end, he must work through the affairs of broken, fallen human beings. Number three, 3, God directs through his governing will and governing authority the affairs of all of humanity to the appointed end. I want to read to you really fast what we see in the book of Proverbs. I think this proverb is standing behind the entirety of the book of Esther. Proverbs chapter 21, verse 1. The king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever his will. And so we have a despicable king, but somehow God is standing behind this king and guiding the actions in his heart, mysteriously so. And so 3 final points, and then we'll close. Number 1, God mysteriously moves the will of even the most powerful agents on earth, kings and governors and politicians and whatever you might say. God mysteriously moves their will. Number 2, God's hand of providence moves events in spite of human and sinful choices. There's not a single person in this story that comes off as virtuous. Mordecai doesn't. Esther, kind of. Xerxes or Ahasuerus, of course not. Haman, no way. They're all fallen, broken, sinful people. And number 3, most comforting of all, as we get ready to take communion, we ponder anew this biblical truth, is that God's hand of providence is guided and buttressed by commitment to his divine covenant. Let me say that again. God's hand of providence is guided and buttressed by his overarching commitment to his good promises. God had made a promise to the people of Israel that he would be their God. They would be his people. They shouldn't even be in Persia in this story, but God still lovingly guides the events because God is motivated and even upholds and cannot lie. He cannot work against his good covenant. Why is that comforting for us? Well, it's very simple, because as we get ready to take communion, we ponder anew that it is Jesus who came for us. And we read in Hebrews 13, verse 8, for example, Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And before Jesus was ascended into heaven, he told his disciples, and by extension us, "Lo, I will be with you always." What that means is that we will inevitably go through hard times, difficult seasons in life, and trials and tribulations. But we have a God who stands behind his promise, and God has effectively proven over and over and over and over and over again that he is a God worthy of trust because he upholds his promises to his people. So therefore, we can trust that when we say that we are saved in Jesus, we are saved in Jesus. We need not question. We need not fear. We need not think that somehow God will change his mind. Jesus also went to the cross in accordance to the perfect will and the perfect plan of God. And it was carried out through the actions of sinful human beings, the Romans and the Jewish authorities at the time. And God used sinful people then, as he still uses sinful people today, to bring about his perfect will. And so when we come to the table today in communion, we're reminded of this simple but incredibly comforting, powerful fact. God is with us. And where he is, we find goodness. And we can trust him.